A mafia don just found his secret daughter dying in a burning Loren car. Moretti spent 5 years turning his heart to ice after his fiancée abandoned him. But when a desperate puppy forces him off the highway during a violent storm, he uncovers a twisted family secret. The woman he thought betrayed him was actually forced into hiding by his own mother. Now, with a rival gang closing in, the boss of Chicago is about to burn his own city to the ground to protect the family he never knew he had. The camera pans over Chicago Interstate 94 at 11 p.m. A brutal November storm is drowning the city. Its rain shatters against the asphalt like gunfire, turning the pitch-black road into a slick, dangerous mirror. Today, you and I are going to unpack this story together. 3 heavily armored series tear through our inside the middle of all. The air is absolutely dead. It is the specific, freezing silence you only feel around men who deal out death for a living. In the back seat sits Lorenzo Moretti, staring out into the dark and completely numb to the world. We often chase power, and wealth, thinking it will fill the empty void inside us. But if you let your soul hollow out along the way, you become nothing more than a ghost riding in a very expensive cage. Look closely at Lorenzo as the streetlight wash over his face. He is the 37 but those cold blue eyes hold the crushing weight of a man who has survived 100 lifetimes of chaos. He wears a sharp, dark coat, simply watching the rain drag across the thick glass. 5 years ago, Elena walked away, taking his spirit with her. Just hours ago, he wiped out a rival syndicate at the harbor. But to him, it is just another empty notch on his belt. Sometimes, holding on to an old ache is the only proof a man has that his heart is still beating. Up front, his top enforcer, Dante, sits bathed in the pale, eerie glow of a phone screen. We learn pretty quickly in this life that winning the war means absolutely nothing if your house is completely empty when you finally come home. Behind the wheels sits Marco, gripping the leather with the tension of 20 years of unshakable loyalty. The wipers are failing miserably against the downpour. Without warning, Marco slams his boot on the brakes. The massive vehicle groans violently as the tires skid across the flooded highway. Backup cars screech to a halt, flooding the lead car with blinding white light. Instantly, Dante draws his weapon, expecting a violent ambush. But it is not a rival crew. Standing right in the harsh glare of the headlights is a tiny, soaking wet puppy, shivering uncontrollably in the cold. We spend time building walls to protect ourselves, forgetting this lace often places in our path just to see if we remember how to care. This exhausted little creature holds its ground in the freezing wind, staring down a machine built for war. Dante tightens his grip on his pistol, demanding Marco hit the gas. Convinced this is a classic mafia decoy tactic, Lorenzo stays quiet in the shadows. Dante shouts, arguing that a boss never stops for anything. But Lorenzo simply raises a single hand, and the cabin falls instantly silent. The puppy pushes through the sludge and presses its muddy paws right up against the bulletproof window. Stick with me here, because this is where everything turns. Courage is not about physical size or power. It is about having the raw guts to step toward the very thing that terrifies you, hoping that taking a massive risk might just save a life. Lorenzo slowly turns his head, and it feels as though the violent storm outside suddenly drops to a breathless whisper. This tiny animal locks eyes with the most feared man in the city. The puppy is not afraid of the thick armor or the bloody teacher. Its wet eyes are full of a desperate grief, piercing straight through to a part of Lorenzo he thought he buried long ago. Dante is practically spitting with rage now, begging him to leave it behind. But Lorenzo tunes him out, He pushes the heavy door open, letting the bitter wind howl into the pristine cabin, and steps into the rain. You can bury humanity under years of violence and cold cash, but true compassion is stubborn. It only takes one crack in the bia for a piece of your soul to break back out. The biting cold punishes Lorenzo. The second his expensive shoes hit the flood street, rain washes over his stoic face, masking the tears he swore he would never let fall again. Up close, you can see the puppy is nothing but sharp ribs and mud, exhaling tiny clouds of white breath. Throwing away his vegetation, the most dangerous man in Chicago drops onto one knee, soaking his tailored trousers in a filthy puddle. The broken little animal does not run, knowing its agonizing wait is finally over. The truth is, people respect you for the power you wield from a high tower, but true loyalty is forged in the mud. Sometimes you have to ruin your facelet's clothes and get your hands absolutely dirty to prove that you still the fragile gift of life. But the dog does not just collapse into his waiting arms. Instead, the tiny survivor bites down hard on the fabric of Lorenzo S. trousers and starts pulling with everything it has, dragging the mob boss toward a pitch-black tree line. Dante completely loses his mind. He screams at his boss to get back in the car, his voice raw over the howling wind. Heavy doors slam as 4 armed guards spill out into the storm, sweeping the dark woods with their weapons. Dante is absolutely furious, entirely convinced this is a rival family, playing a twisted game. We build massive walls of paranoia to keep our enemies out, but those walls can blind us. When you expect every shadow to hide a knife, you completely miss the desperate pleas for help happening right down at your own 2 feet. Dante is certain they are stepping into a slaughterhouse, warning that a hidden sniper is likely waiting in the brush. Lorenzo ignores him entirely, his attention fixed on the shaking dog. The animal is practically choking itself, crying out between violent tugs. Slowly, the mob boss stands up to his full height. His tailored coat is heavy with freezing water, but his eyes are completely dead to the fear around him. He turns to his driver, Marco says, his voice flat. "You and 2 men are coming with me." Dante steps forward, desperate to join, but Lorenzo cuts him off. Life teaches us a very hard lesson about fear. If you want to find the real truth behind a tragedy, you cannot stand safely on the edge. You must walk directly into the darkness and let the pain lead the way. Dante snaps that he does not trust this setup for a single second. Lorenzo turns slowly, letting a heavy, dangerous silence settle over the beating rain. "You stay right here," Lorenzo orders. "If this goes bad, I need my best man watching our only exit. But you and I need to look closer at what happens next." For a split second, something very dark flashes across Dante's face. It is a subtle shift, maybe wounded pride, or maybe the cold calculation of a traitor. "Understood," Dante mutters. Lorenzo turns away as the puppy sprints into the dead woods. Marco clicks on a tactical flashlight, carving a white path through the rain. It is a harsh reality of the criminal underworld and of life itself. The loudest voice warning you about a trap is very often the person holding the wire. Up on the slick highway, Dante stands like a statue until his boss disappears into the trees. Then, checking his shoulder, he quietly slips a phone from his pocket. Let us step into the deep woods with Lorenzo. The atmosphere shifts violently. The screaming wind gets choked out by the heavy timber, turning the rain into a sinister whisper. Flashlights cut through the dark, exposing jagged, wet roots. Lorenzo feels a sudden crushing weight in his chest. It is not the fear of an assassin waiting in the dark. It is that old, suffocating grief he thought he killed 5 years ago. Up ahead, the dog stops dead at a steep cliff. We all carry a heavy ghost we refuse to talk about until a life finally grabs us by the collar and forces us to stare right into its empty, haunting eyes. The terrified puppy freezes at the edge of the drop. Its ears are pinned back, ribs shaking violently, but it makes no sound. It just stares down into the black void. Marco sweeps his flashlight forward, and the beam hits a massive burned skid mark cutting across an abandoned service road. The thick steel guardrail is shredded like cheap paper, pointing straight down into the abyss. Lorenzo's pulse begins to pound in his ears. Marco pans the light down the steep embankment, revealing absolute devastation. A white SUV lies entirely upside down, sinking into a muddy grave 50 feet below. It is a stark reminder for all of us. Sometimes the deepest, ugliest tragedies are not out in the open. They are buried just off the main road, in the dark places nobody bothers to look. The shattered windshield lies scattered across the slick mud, catching the flashlight beams like broken diamonds. The driver door is ripped backward, hanging by twisted metal, while thick grey smoke hisses from the crushed engine. For a few agonizing seconds, Lorenzo forgets how to breathe. The grim reality hits him hard. Whoever is bleeding out in that wreckage has been trapped there for hours, long enough for a tiny dog to climb a massive hill and flag down a crime syndicate. Suddenly, the puppy lets out a sound that will echo in Lorenzo's nightmares forever. It is not a bark, but a shattering, human-like scream of pure loss. Grief is a heavy burden, but it is the one universal language that absolutely every living creature on this earth speaks fluently. Let us examine this sequence together, because the visual storytelling here is striking. A battered stray dog flings itself down a jagged ravine, sliding through freezing mud toward the smoking ruins of an overturned car. Up on the ridge, Marco screams for his boss to wait, but Lorenzo is already in motion. He throws himself over the steep edge, tearing blindly through the unforgiving dirt. Tree branches strike his face. A jagged root tears his expensive coat, and he hits the ground hard, tasting bitter rain and mud, yet he forces himself back up without a single second of hesitation. Marco keeps shouting, but Lorenzo hears only the storm and his own racing pulse. Sometimes, we must completely block out the frantic voices of the world and simply leap toward what matters most. The camera frames the wreckage like a painting of absolute judgment. Cold rain batters the asphalt, unable to wash away the suffocating stench of raw gasoline. It hits Lorenzo Giorgio in the chest, a foul vapor burning his throat long before he reaches the crumpled steel. A dark puddle bleeds into the mud, creeping toward the hot engine. One spark would vaporize everything. You and I know what a man surviving 20 years in the Chicago underworld should do. Every instinct screams at him to run, but he stops beside the smoking tires. A small puppy paws frantically at the shattered glass, whining into the storm. It brings us back to a very simple human lesson. Real courage is never about being completely fearless. True bravery is making the choice to take that terrifying step forward right when the rest of the world is nearly near you to look away. Lorenzo raises his flashlight, letting a cold beam slice through the twisted shadows of the cabin. The light catches a fragile hand hanging from the inverted roof, fingers swaying in the freezing downpour. There are no expensive diamonds here, just the soft silver band kept only to hold on to a fading memory. Notice how his iron grip suddenly falters. The flashlight trembles in his fist. He used to hold a hand exactly like that in a life that feels hundreds of years removed from his current empire. He drops to his knees in the thick mud, peering into the nightmare of crushed steel. It leaves us with a brutal lesson. The ghosts we try so desperately to outrun are usually waiting patiently for us, buried right inside the wreckage of our own choices. The camera lingers on the woman suspended in the driver's seat, held by a fraying seatbelt. Her dark hair spills toward the earth like a curtain, hiding her face. A line of crimson traces down her temple, falling drop by agonizing drop onto the ruined dashboard. She does not breathe. Then, drifting from the deepest corner of that crushed tomb, Lorenzo catches a faint sound. The storm almost swallows it, but he hears it. A child is crying. He draws his pistol without a second thought. Flipping the heavy grip, he swings it down like a hammer, exploding the window into a shower of glass and rain. It reveals a simple truth we all must face. Sometimes we have to completely shatter the harsh, jagged barriers in front of us to rescue the fragile innocence left shivering in the dark. The heavy rain beats down on the wreckage. A terrified puppy darts away from the steel, only to spin back with a panicked whine. Up the slope, Marco is screaming, begging his boss to retreat before the pooling gasoline ignites. But Lorenzo does not flinch. He crouches low, peering into the smoking ruin. The air is thick with raw fuel and the copper stench of blood. Deep in the shadows, a tiny figure appears. A little girl hangs trapped upside down in her car seat. She is trembling violently, her pink dress stained with dark earth. It is a sobering reflection that the most innocent Muslims often endure the most devastating impacts. This tragic reality teaches us why we must cultivate the unwavering strength to shield the gentle ones from the violence of this world. Child that clutches a worn, stuffed bear, holding it like her final anchor in a dying world. With one trembling hand, she pulls weakly at the unconscious woman in the front seat. Her voice is shattered as she begs her mother to wake up. In that agonizing second, something heavily guarded inside Lorenzo finally snaps. Sweeping the glass aside with his tailored sleeve, he forces himself headfirst into the crushed metal. He twists his broad shoulders through the gap, letting the sharp steel slice deep into his flesh. He feels absolutely zero pain, dragging his bare elbows across the broken glass. It is a beautiful illustration of how profound compassion can us blind to our own bleeding suffering, especially when a fragile soul desperately needs our help. A tangled, wet mass of dark hair hides the woman's face. The only sound in that freezing cabin at the bottom of the ravine is the ragged pull of Lorenzo's breath. You see the heavy tremor in his fingers, a man who built a ruthless empire now shaking. He brushes the cold strands aside and his universe shatters. A wretched, choking sound breaks from his chest. It is Elena. 5 years of burying his soul in syndicate wars evaporate in a heartbeat. Now she bleeds out against the rusted metal. He stares at the delicate freckles he spent half a decade mourning. We often tell ourselves that time heals all wounds, but the truth is tragic. Time is just a grave digger. It buries our deepest pain in the earth, waiting for a violent storm to wash the dirt away. We run from our ghosts, only to find them waiting at the end of the road. Lorenzo stares at Elena, tracing the pale lips he kissed her before the underworld devoured his soul, and shadows frame the wreckage. A freezing raindrop slides from his matted heifer onto her bruised cheek. Then another drop falls, warm, trembling, a silent tear this ruthless boss would never acknowledge. Outside, Marco screams through the wind, warning the engine is about to blow. Lorenzo remains a statue of grief. Then a tiny voice cuts the smoking silence. A little girl peers through the crushed leather, her muddy face locked in sheer dimmer. Yeah, you see, life has a brutal way of forcing us to shatter our emotional paralysis speed, precisely when an innocent soul begs for our immediate action. The child clutches a dirty stuffed bear, her small voice trembling as she asks if he will save her mother. In that suspended frame, the guarded heart of this syndicate boss stops beating. Through the smoky lighting, he truly sees her. Framed by soaked lashes, the eyes staring back are impossibly familiar. They are a piercing, icy blue, pale as a winter sky. They are his very own eyes reflected in the face of a daughter he never knew existed. He chokes on the metallic air as the gravity of this tragedy settles into his bones. The ruined engine shrieks like a kettle. Destiny has wicked senses of irony. It often hands you the fragile key to your ultimate redemption, precisely as your surrounding world prepares to go up in absolute flames. Lorenzo forces his gravelly voice into a softness it has never known, begging the terrified girl to be brave. She nods slowly, her tiny lip trembling as she crushes the bear to her chest. We often forget that real strength is never measured by the enemies we destroy, but by how gently we hold what matters. Lorenzo grips the jammed buckle, but the melted plastic refuses to budge. With a sharp metallic click, he draws his folding knife, the steel catching the fire's orange glow. For the first time in his violent life, this blade becomes an instrument of sheer grace. He slices the thick nylon, catching her feather-light frame against his chest. Curling his broad shoulders to shield her from the shattered glass, he backs out into the merciless, freezing wind of the storm. The ruined chassis groans, sliding deeper into the freezing mud. Marco sprints down the slope, taking the shivering child and shielding her against his vest. He screams for his boss to run, but Lorenzo completely freezes. We often find that the most irrational choices we make are what proves our soul remains intact. A frantic stray puppy is still trapped inside, barking wildly over Elena. Ignoring every survival instinct, Lorenzo throws himself back into the metallic time bomb. Elena is pinned brutally, the belt crushing her ribs against the caved-in door. He carefully slides his blade between the taut fabric and her chest. It is terribly easy to just walk away. But standing firm in the absolute center of a danger zone is what truly defines our human character. Watch as this tragedy reaches its climax. The first snaps, but the harness stubbornly resists. From deep within the engine block, there is a tiny, sinister pop. The quietest warnings always arrive seconds before catastrophic explosions. Marco screams from the ridge as the final thread gives way. Elena collapses against Lorenzo, driven by raw adrenaline. He hauls her over his shoulder, scoops up the puppy, and launches himself out the window. They barely clear the jagged before the fuel tank violently detonates. Shockwave of the orange fire slams his spine. Even as they are hurled through the air, his newfound humanity dictated his instinct. He wraps his heavy frame around them both, entirely absorbing the bone-crushing impact of the freezing earth. The shower of metal finally settles. Lorenzo lies draped over Elena, his heavy coat smoking from the heat. His back screams in agony, yet he refuses to move until he feels the faint rise of her chest. She is breathing. We know all too well that true strength has nothing to do with the enemies you destroy. Real power is measured only by the suffering you willingly endure for love. Behind them, the ruined iron car burns like a signal fire against the black sky. A fragile voice cuts through the howling storm as the little girl cries out. Lorenzo forces his broken body upward, the freezing rain washing the blood from his bruised face. He looks into her panicked eyes, shedding his dark syndicate persona entirely, and promises her that her mother is going to be all right. Look closely at this frame with me, right where the tragedy pivots. The camera lingers on the little girl as she stares up, the relentless rain washing away her warm tears. Her tiny voice cuts through the storm, asking why this strange man shares her exact face. You and I both know that the truth will always hunt us down, no matter how fast we run. That single question shatters Lorenzo. Down in the mud, a shivering puppy crawls toward the unconscious Elena, whining softly. Marco scrambles down the steep bank, yelling that the nearest hospital is 20 minutes out. Guards rush forward with a canvas stretcher, but Lorenzo raises one hand, his face carved from stone. No hospitals, he snaps. Marco freezes in the downpour, stunned by the cold weight of that absolute command. The lens shifts to the stark paranoia of the criminal underworld. Public hospitals mean signed paperwork, and flashing lights mean exposed secrets. Lorenzo knows the mechanics of survival better than any man breathing. He scoops up the shivering puppy, the tiny creature tight against his soaked coat. If a bitter rival orchestrated this crash, he must hide the bleeding woman from the watchful world. He barks an order to summon their private doctor immediately. Up on the jagged ridge, Dante stands perfectly still, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He watches the rescue like a ghost. There is a simple lesson hiding in his dead eyes. Silence is never truly empty. It is choked with the heavy, brutal secrets we are entirely too terrified to speak out loud. Lorenzo marches past Dante, the wet gravel crunching like broken glass beneath his boots. He roars for his men to load the black vehicles. That 40-minute drive back to the estate plays out like a slow funeral march, rain hammering the steel roof. Usually, those vast iron gates project a quiet arrogance of wealth. Tonight, they merely guard a desperate bunker against the violent storm. The stands waiting in the pale porch light. Lorenzo ignores them, carrying the unconscious little girl inside himself, her chin resting on his broad shoulder. Life teaches us that the heaviest burdens we ever carry are often the ones that physically weigh nothing at all. Marco carries Elena up the stone steps, while the small, loyal puppy trails closely behind them like a dark little shadow. Dr. Hartwell pushes through the doors at 1 in the morning. He's dripping warm water onto the posh floors. He has patched up this violent syndicate for 20 years by following one simple rule: do the messy work and swallow your questions. He treats Elena directly on the dark velvet sofa, shadows dancing across the walls. A tense half-hour ticks by before he slowly stands, wiping his fogged glasses. He notes a mild concussion and cracked ribs, amazed by her sheer luck. We rarely appreciate the fragile nature of our own survival until the Grim Reaper finally walks away. Hartwell mutters that whoever pulled her from the wreck saved her life. Lorenzo asks about the little girl, a rare tremor in his voice. The weary doctor sighs, saying she only needs quiet rest and her rescue dog. The camera pans down to the mud on Lorenzo's boots. The tiny rescue puppy has curled into a tight ball beside Elena, resting his chin delicately against her ankle. Lorenzo quietly orders the staff to leave the creature alone. Suddenly, the soft click of slippers echoes down the marble staircase. Lorenzo watched his mother, Isabella, descend in a sweeping black robe. She moves with the frozen grace of a queen inspecting a ruined empire. A wise person knows that true power never rushes blindly toward a crisis. It simply waits for the panic to bleed itself dry. Isabella opens her mouth to demand answers, but the syllables die in her throat. Her cold eyes lock onto the bruised woman resting on the velvet cushions, and sheer, undeniable terror strips every drop of color from her aging face. The framing tightens on Isabella's hands. She grips the banister until her knuckles fade to a sickly white. Her jaw parts, but the room remains painfully silent. Her panicked gaze drifts, landing on the small child curled up in the massive armchair. Isabella clutches her throat, swaying like a woman struck by an invisible ghost. Lorenzo watches her drown, observing every twitch of her face with cold patience. "Mother," he murmurs, his voice a slow, dangerous rumble. "What have you kept from me?" We eventually learn that the truth always casts a suffocating shadow no matter how much dirt we throw over it. Isabella stares back, tears brimming in her eyes, before fleeing into the dark hallway. Across the foyer, hidden entirely from view, Dante mutters frantically into a glowing burner phone. The boss found her," Dante hisses into a knot of anxiety twisting his voice. The scene dissolves into the quiet hours of early morning. Little Sophia flutters her heavy eyelids open. The camera points straight up, capturing her view of a grand ceiling draped in carved plaster. A chandelier hangs like a frozen waterfall, scattering shards of light across the room. She blinks, fighting to arrange the jagged pieces of her nightmare, the roaring rain, the tearing steel, her mother refusing to wake up, and that tragic man who shared her exact face. It is a devastating reality that a child's mind is fragile, yet perfectly preserves the exact traumas we pray they forget. She sits up with a sharp gasp, rubbing her bruised elbow, totally lost and confused inside this ocean of a strange, empty bed. A sudden shift at the edge of the mattress makes her pull back. Boog. Slowly, Bandit, the battered survivor puppy, lifts his heavy head. The second their eyes lock, as his tiny tail beats a steady drum against the duvet. "Bandit," Sophia whispers, her voice breaking. She scrambles across the sheets and buries her face deep into his neck. He licks the dried tears from her cheek, leaning his warm forehead against hers. Remember this truth: the most profound comfort in a shattered world often arrives from gentle souls who cannot utter a single word. They sit frozen in the vast, silent room. "Where is Mommy?" she murmurs into his soft fur. The brave dog simply hops down to the floor, pausing at the half-open wooden door, waiting patiently to guide her out into the dark, unknown hallway. But before leaving, she spots her worn stuffed bear sitting on a velvet chair. Someone in this ruthless house actually took a moment to tie a fresh silk ribbon around its neck. She squeezes the toy under her arm and steps barefoot into the echoing corridor. To a child, this scale is terrifying. Slabs of cold marble stretch into the shadows, flanked by looming oak doors. Massive oil portraits of dead, unsmiling men stare down, their painted eyes guiding Taninga. At every move, she reaches up to the brass handle of the first door. There she is. Her mother lies beneath a heavy quilt, a clean white bandage resting across her pale temple. A nurse knits quietly in the dim corner. You and I have to admit, sleep is often the only true shield we have left against the agonizing realities of the waking world. The nurse whispers that her mother simply needs the medicine to quit work and will wake up soon, so Sophia offers a solemn nod before gently clicking the door shut. The tiny girl and her dog resume their ghost-like patrol of the sprawling estate. They discover a grand staircase sweeping downward like a marble waterfall. She grips the polished mahogany rail with both hands, her small voice echoing as she counts. 18, 24, 32. Isn't human curiosity a strange, beautiful flaw? It almost always finds a way to conquer our most paralyzing fears. Upon reaching the bottom floor, she pushes against a set of heavy double doors and completely freezes in her tracks. The room is a massive, dimly lit library, and sitting right there in a worn leather chair is the tragic man with her exact blue eyes. Picture this quietly devastating frame. Lorenzo sits in the gloom, his scarred hands wrapped around a mug, staring blankly through the rain-slicked glass. He is a man actively drowning in his own history. You and I know the cruel truth. The absolute heaviest baggage we ever carry is the past we refuse to confront. Suddenly, tiny Sophia breaks the boundary of his private sanctuary. She asks if this giant house belongs to him, entirely immune to the lethal aura radiating off his skin. Lorenzo jolts in his seat, dark coffee sloshing over the ceramic rim. Unbothered, she hauls herself up into the opposite leather armchair, letting the dog curl over her toes. "I am 5, she announces with pure authority, demanding his actual name. He murmurs his dark title into the quiet room, and she simply scrunches her nose in playful defiance. The camera lingers on this incredible contrast. A tiny child is effortlessly disarming a man who commands an empire of blood. Sitting in that chair, Sophia decides Lorenzo is far too complicated, casually renaming him Mr. Lowe. For the first time in a decade, a genuine chuckle scrapes its way out of the monster's chest. The warmth dies instantly when she leans forward. She innocently asks why they have the exact same blue eyes, mentioning her father died before she drew breath. This proves that pure innocence will always shatter our most guarded walls. Upstairs, Elena finally groans, her bruised eyelids fluttering open. She stares blindly at the heavy velvet canopy, completely unaware that the brutal, unstoppable collision of her dark past and fragile present is already tearing through the quiet white halls of the estate. Reality shatters Elena's peace with the unforgiving force of a freight train. Every battered muscle screams in sheer agony as she forces herself upright, the room spinning into a dizzying blur of cream walls and dark oak. The physical torment pales next to the psychological terror gripping her throat as she stares at the suffocating portrait above the fireplace. She is trapped inside the Moretti estate. You and I have witnessed this tragedy before, and it leaves us with an undeniable truth. You can run until your legs give out, but your past is always breathing down your neck. A maternal panic erupts from her chest as she screams for her daughter, the roars tearing through the silence. Just then, the heavy oak door clicks open. Lorenzo steps into the room. Lorenzo stands in the doorway, his face an unreadable mask of iron control. The silence between them is deafening, pressing heavily against the room. For 5 agonizing years, Elena rehearsed this exact confrontation, preparing every desperate excuse. Yet, now, facing the man she fled, her terrified mind goes blank. Finally, his steady voice slices through the quiet, informing her that Sophia is safe downstairs, eating pancakes under the watchful eye of the guard dog. All the frantic tension instantly drains from Elena. It reveals a painful reality about human endurance. Carrying a massive burden of fear for years will slowly bend your spine, but the sudden release of it will leave you shattered on the floor. The profound relief hits her like a collapsing building. Hot tears stream down Elena's face as Lorenzo closes the oak door and steps into her space. He stares at her with intense, penetrating eyes, the exact same eyes she passed down to their little girl. The air turns freezing as his voice drops into a dangerously quiet register, demanding to know why she vanished for 5 years without a single word. Guilt begins eating her alive. As we all eventually learn, shame is a heavy anchor that drags your eyes straight to the floor every time. She cannot bear to look at him as she chokes out a broken apology, finally confirming the unspoken truth about his child. Lorenzo slowly closes his eyes, absorbing this brutal confession straight to the chest like a physical blow. The quiet emotional devastation radiating through the room is absolute. When Lorenzo opens his eyes, the impenetrable armor of a ruthless syndicate boss has melted away. He stands utterly shattered, raw agony visible in every line of his face. His voice scraping there like sandpaper as he asks why she let him believe she did not love him enough to stay. Elena whispers that she had to protect their baby. When he demands to know from what, she delivers a devastating psychological strike. From Mame, she had to protect the child from him. She painted a grim picture for cartels and body bags, refusing to let her daughter memorize escape routes in the dark. It is a harsh reality, but it teaches an enduring truth. Protecting the innocent peace of your family must always remain your absolute priority, no matter the terrible personal cost or to your own breaking heart. Elena pleads, her voice trembling as she swears her love was real. But the moment she became pregnant, the story shifted to the survival of their child. Lorenzo simply stares, accusing her of lacking the faith to even try. In that second, Elena almost unleashes the darkest secret of all, the toxic threat, the blood money, and the cold demands from his own mother, Isabella. The devastating truth sits on the edge of her tongue, ready to burn his world down. Instead, she swallows the poison, honoring her bitter promise. Seeing her silence, Lorenzo's emotional vault slams shut. He turns and walks away without a word. It reminds us of a quiet, painful reality. The absolute heaviest burdens we ever carry are the dark truths we willingly swallow to protect the people we love. His heart is shattered, yet Lorenzo cannot summon a single drop of anger toward her. Stick with me, because you and I are about to unpack what happens to a ruthless man when his iron emotional armor finally cracks. Heartbreak like this completely rewires the soul. At dawn, having not slept a second, Lorenzo steps into the damp garden, gripping his black coffee like a lifeline. The violent storm has passed, leaving the massive estate washed clean. Haunting mist drifts across the sprawling lawn. Down by the pond, he spots the tiny rescue puppy, Bandit, fast asleep in a rare patch of sunlight. Someone actually gave the fragile little dog a warm bath. Finding a quiet spark of a gentle peace in the middle of absolute devastating need, devastating chaos is a vital survival lesson we all must remember. Bandit is clean now, though the poor animal remains painfully thin. A tiny bandage wraps his paw where broken glass caught him during the rescue. Lorenzo sits on the freezing stone bench, studying the sleeping pup. Consider the gravity of this scenes. This is a hardened crime boss who spent 37 years refusing to shed a tear, burying his humanity beneath violence. Yet right now, he fights a total emotional collapse over a dog that could fit in his pocket. He murmurs softly, and Bandit twitches a fuzzy ear. With a choked voice, Lorenzo whispers that if the dog had not darted in front of his car, he never would have found his family. The profound truth is that the universe often sends the most unexpected messengers to completely rewrite your destiny. Did you know that? Lorenzo asks. Bandit lifts his head, revealing wise, ancient eyes that contradict his fragile frame. He locks his solemn gaze with the crime boss, wobbles across the grass, and presses his cold nose into Lorenzo's shaking hand. Lorenzo wraps his scarred fingers around that tiny head, whispering a broken thank you. Suddenly, the patter of small footsteps shatters the morning silence. Sophia sprints across the lawn, swallowed in a borrowed sweater that is far too big. She clutches a chocolate cookie, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold. She skids to a halt, breathlessly asking if she can give Bandit a tiny treat. Showing pure gratitude to the loyal souls who quietly protect our breaking hearts is a profound life lesson we must never forget. She promises he must not give him too much, proudly announcing that the cook approved. Lorenzo simply nods, fully aware his voice will shatter if he tries to speak. Sophia carefully snaps the cookie and holds a crumb flat on her palm. Bandit takes it with the gentlest bite imaginable. Sophia lets out a bright laugh that instantly brings the gloomy garden back to vibrant life. She flops down on the damp grass next to Lorenzo's heavy boots, happily scratching the dog behind his ears. She explains how Bandit was her birthday gift last year from a kind woman in Wisconsin, marveling at how incredibly small he used to be. The
essentialness is of with the most
unbreakable loyalty
you will ever witness.
Sophia holds 2 fingers an inch apart, showing how small the puppy was. She explains she had to bottle feed him, and her mother promised Bandit was sent to protect her. She tells the towering mafia boss she thinks the dog is pretty good at his job. Lorenzo feels a heavy knot in his throat. He studies this scrawny animal who braved fire and glass to reunite a broken family. Yeah, Lorenzo whispers. He is pretty good. Later, Lorenzo stands on the balcony, watching his daughter the puppy around the rose bushes. Bandit pounces, making her shriek with joy. That haunted estate is finally alive with genuine laughter. Let's look at this together. True family is absolutely everything, and protecting that precious bond is the ultimate purpose of our brief existence. For the first time in years, the Moretti mansion does not feel like an echoing tomb. The cycle of grief is breaking. Then, heavy footsteps stomp up from behind. Enter Dante, the brutally loyal right-hand man. Dante drops a cynical take, warning Lorenzo to be cautious. He argues that a woman and kid popping up in the middle of a bloody turf war is suspicious. He suspects a lethal does not blink. Without raising his voice, he tells Dante to shut his mouth. Instantly, the room's atmosphere plummets to freezing. The crucial lesson here: sometimes you must forcefully silence the toxic, paranoid voices around you to protect the delicate new life you are trying to build. For the first time, deep love finally triumphs over endless paranoia. Picture Isabella, the iron-fisted matriarch of the family, suddenly vanishing inside her own massive home. She locks her bedroom door, letting her son assume she is just exhausted. But a heavy, dark guilt is eating her alive. Every time she closes her eyes, she is haunted by the image of a little girl clinging to a one-eyed teddy bear. That child is her own blood, a granddaughter she pushed away for 5 years. Isabella essentially robbed herself, choosing pride over connection. It brings up a deeply painful lesson. The absolute worst prisons we will ever experience are the ones we build with our own 2 hands. By the 3rd day of this suffocating misery, she finally forces her tired bones out into the quiet air of her private rose garden. The garden was a haunting shrine of withered roses, an untouchable tribute to Isabella's late husband. She sits alone beneath the pale pergola, paralyzed in the autumn chill, accepting the freezing wind as a rightful penalty. We often learn the hard way that the bitterest cold, the bitterest does not come from the winter air, but from the crushing weight of our own destructive choices. Suddenly, the gravel crunches. There stands little Sophia, wrapped in a faded pink coat with mismatched buttons, dragging a worn, stuffed bear. She fixes her fearless eyes on the terrifying matriarch. "Hello," the child says, completely untroubled by the heavy shadow of the syndicate. Isabella forgets how to breathe, managing only a broken whisper in return as the brave little girl takes a careful step closer. Sophia stops a few feet away. The camera pans down to her small shoes. She tilts her head, studying the older woman with the brutal honesty only a young child possesses. "Why do you keep looking at me and then crying?" the girl asks. The dim lighting catches dust motes standing between them. Isabella tries to answer, but the words turn to ash. Let us look at this moment together. Here sits an underworld queen who commands politicians. Yet all that bloody wealth crumbles before pure innocence. It reminds us of a quiet truth. Power is just a fragile illusion when faced with simple honesty. Finding the matriarch silent, Sophia takes action. She climbs onto the creaking wooden bench, settling her worn stuffed bear. "My mommy says when you feel sad, you should get a big hug," she announces gently. "Do you want me to give you a hug?" It is the simplest question in the world, yet it shatters the cold fortress Isabella spent decades building around her chest. The Iron Lady completely breaks. She lets out a raw, devastating gasp, a ragged sound she has not allowed herself to make since her husband died. She pulls the little girl into her shaking arms, holding on tightly, as if trying to piece her own ruined soul back together. The beautiful tragedy is that Sophia hugs her right back. No hesitation, those tiny arms wrapped tightly around the old woman's neck. In this quiet, tear-stained minute, we see a profound reality. True forgiveness does not always require a massive apology. Sometimes it just takes an open heart. Eventually, Sophia pulls back slightly and begins to chat, entirely unaware of how heavy next words will be. Sophia softly murmurs about their old apartment, remembering how her mother would cry in the dark. "I asked why she was sad, and Mommy told me about a mother who loved her sons so much that she chased everyone else away," the child explains. The camera lingers on Isabella's trembling hands on. "Mommy said she was not bad, just sad. We need to pause and let this profound truth sink in. For 5 brutal years, Elena raised a child alone under the shadow of mafia threats. Yet, she never poisoned her daughter with a single drop of hate. Choosing grace over toxic bitterness is truly the highest form of human strength." Hearing this quiet revelation, Isabella forgets to breathe. The fierce boss buries her weeping face deep into Sophia's hebe, desperately shielding her total emotional collapse from this incredibly sweet child. By 11 at night, the sprawling mansion falls into a heavy silence. Sophia is gently patting Isabella's bare back in the dim light, calming the powerful woman as if she were a nervous bird. Everybody cries, sometimes as the child whispers, melting the last of the matriarch's icy exterior. But across the room, a completely different storm is brewing in the shadows. Lorenzo is done playing games. Throughout dinner, he watched his mother fail to meet his wife's eyes. He noted the violent tremor in her hand as she held her wineglass. The bloody pieces finally clicked together. When his wounded wife was brought home, his mother showed no shock, only the grim recognition of her own dark handiwork. It is a chilling reminder of a harsh truth sometimes. The most dangerous enemies we face are the ones sitting across from us at our own dinner table. The massive house finally plunges into complete darkness. Elena and the child are sleeping safely upstairs, but Lorenzo is wide awake. He waits for the staff to leave before marching down the long corridor to his mother's room. One sharp knock. He demands she follow him to his study, and she offers no resistance. They enter the office, lit only by a dying red fire. He pours himself a whiskey, deliberately leaving her empty-handed. She sits in the leather chair, trying to wrap herself in her familiar armor of untouchable pride. But Lorenzo simply stands by the fading embers, glaring at the woman who raised him. True betrayal permanently changes how we see people, stripping away all history. He is no longer looking at his mother. He is staring at a dangerous traitor. "Mother," he warns, his tone dropping dangerously low. "What did you do to Elena 5 years ago?" He demands. The atmosphere in the room grows suffocatingly tense. The silence stretching between them is heavy enough to crush bone. Isabella remains totally silent, her eyes locked on the floor. "Do not make me ask twice," he snaps, his voice cracking like a whip. In that a single moment, the unstoppable Iron Lady shatters. Her shoulders tremble violently, tears falling as she buries her face in her hands. "I threatened her," she finally confesses, She admits to telling Elena that if she did not vanish, the crime family would destroy her loved ones with fake legal charges. To see the terrible acts people will justify in the name of loyalty. We learn a hard lesson here. Real love empowers those about, while toxic protection only brings cruelty to those who never ask for it. I said all of those terrible things, she weeps. The camera slows, catching the exact second Lorenzo freezes. His glass hovers just below his chin in the dim light. I gave her $500,000. Isabella chokes out. I told her she would never be anything but trash to our empire. The explosion is violently sudden. Lorenzo slams his head heavy-fisted into the mahogany desk. The bottle flips, crashing onto the marble floor, filling the air with the sharp sting of liquor.
Do you have any earthly idea what you took from me? My daughter. 5 entire years. The tragic weight of this betrayal hits the viewer directly in the chest.
We all eventually learn this brutal truth: time is the single currency you can never earn back. Stolen time is a cruel thief that leaves a soul completely bankrupt. Mother, he roars with a force that shakes the room. Lorenzo never loses his composure, but tonight 5 years of buried agony break loose. She raised our child alone in an apartment I could have bought in cash. Sophia grew up thinking her father was dead. He stares down at her, his spirit completely destroyed. I drank myself into darkness every night, believing I chased away the only woman I loved, and it was your fault. The camera follows Isabella as she physically crumbles. The untouchable queen of the underworld now kneels in a pathetic puddle of whiskey and shattered glass. I thought she was just a gold digger, she whispers softly. It is a devastating picture that is a bitter lesson. Being blindly arrogant and assuming you are always right will ultimately cost you everything you love. I have been wrong every single day, she sobs. The camera focuses on Lorenzo. I is so disgusted he cannot stomach the sight of her. Hyde turns, marches out, and kicks open the doors into the freezing Chicago night. The wind is savage, biting straight to the bone. He stands barefoot on the icy grass, and under the pale moonlight, the feared syndicate boss breaks down in tears for the first time since my boyhood. His massive rescue dog, Bandit, quietly walks up and rests a heavy head against his shaking leg. It shows a simple truth: animals always know when your spirit is completely crushed. But the scene cuts away because the danger is not over. Miles away, tucked inside a decaying meatpacking plant, 2 blacked-out cars sit idle in the dead of night. The relentless cycle of violence is about to spin once again. Let us step back and look at the framing of this scene together. We drop into a freezing warehouse in the dead of night, a freight train screaming in the distance. Dante stands across from the rival boss, Salvatore Vanzetti. Sal wears a classic mafia facade, flashing heavy gold rings and polite artificial smile that has sent countless men to an early grave. Sal asks if Lorenzo, the untouchable titan of the city, has finally gone soft. Dante shakes his head, delivering a chilling line. He replies that Lorenzo has not gone soft. He has gone human, which is infinitely more dangerous. It is a perfectly constructed moment that highlights a painful truth of their reality. The very second you let your guard down to genuinely love another person, you place a massive target directly on your own back. The blocking here is critical. Johnny drops the bombshell to the rival boss. Elena Russo is alive. She's hidden at Lorenzo's estate with a 5-year-old child, his own blood. The camera pushes in to catch the dark calculation ignite in Sal's eyes, like a starving wolf catching the scent of prey. Sal knows the souls are Lorenzo's fatal weakness. Dante slams his hands onto the cold metal table, the loud smack exposing his tragic origins. He has waited 20 agonizing years to find a single crack in Lorenzo's armor, and now he has two. His mind flashes back to being a helpless boy, watching his father take a fatal bullet to protect Lorenzo's father. This proves a haunting life lesson. Holding on to a bitter, vengeful grudge for decades will entirely eat your soul alive. Let us look closely at the roots of this tragedy. The camera sweeps into a painful flashback. The elders looked a devastated 14-year-old Dante in the eye, declaring his father a hero and promising the syndicate would protect him. The lighting shifts to cold blue, revealing his real shelter, a freezing apartment where the boy was forced to run illegal weapons. Meanwhile, Lorenzo was raised in a sunlit mansion to inherit a massive empire. For 2 decades, Dante played the dutiful guard dog, bowing with a hollow smile. The old boss believed he was forging a loyal enforcer, blind to the fact that he was nurturing a ticking time bomb in his own home. The tragic lesson is undeniable here. When you demand absolute loyalty but offer someone only profound disrespect, you are not securing a legacy. You are training your own assassin. Picture the opening frame with me. A freezing, dimly lit room. The camera pushes in on Dante. Every time the word boss leaves his lips for Lorenzo, a physical sickness coils in his gut. His father bled into the concrete so the Morettas could build their throne, and Dante is here to balance that blood-soaked ledger. Across this decaying city, Sal, a rival patriarch, exhales and laughs a rattling, chilling laugh. He studies dances, a killer with a ruined body and the tragic heart of a poet. The deal is absolute. Sal demands the lives of Lorenzo, Elena, and their innocent child. In exchange, Dante gets Chicago just so a dying kingpin can own the harbor. Look closely at this frame, because unchecked greed will always blind powerful men to the very monsters they create in the dark. The lighting shifts to cold blues as an iron handshake seals and dies this sinister pact. When Sal presses for a timeline, the camera captures the terrifying stillness in Dante. He knows Lorenzo is drowning in paranoia, walling himself behind armed guards. But Dante understands the architecture of a tragedy. Every fortress has a crack. He will wait for that brief window when Lorenzo steps out for syndicate business. In the shadows, Dante closes his eyes, savoring 20 years of agonizing patience. It is a terrifying truth we must face. Revenge is a wildfire you cannot control. It will gladly burn your own home to ashes just to kill a single rat. Smash cut to the sprawling estate, where a shattered Lorenzo drags his heavy legs up the grand staircase to face Elena. Let us step into the bedroom and examine this heavy scene together. The frame slows. A book slips from Elena's trembling hands the moment Lorenzo appears in the doorway. His eyes are hollow, completely emptied of life. The deception is over. He quietly confesses that his mother revealed the brutal blackmail that forced Elena away. As her spine curves into wrenching sobs, Lorenzo does not yell. He simply radiates a devastating, quiet sorrow. He lowers himself onto the edge of the mattress, leaving an agonizing ocean of space between them. He speaks softly, terrified that a single touch might shatter her into dust, whispering that she no longer has to carry this alone. Carrying a dark secret will slowly crush your spirit, but the raw truth is the only force that can set you free. Elena completely fractures under the harsh bedroom lighting. Her voice breaks as she confesses to carrying this toxic poison for 5 grueling years, all because she gave his ruthless mother her word. Lorenzo leans forward, the heartbreak carved deeply into his face, begging to know why she endured such torment. Tears track through her makeup as she whispers that the truth would have forced him to hate his own blood forever. The emotional devastation here is absolute. Lorenzo simply stares, slowly extending his scarred hand across the sheets to grasp hers. The crushing irony hits him. She raised their daughter in a crumbling apartment, bearing the world alone, while he drowned his grief in a palatial mansion. True love is rarely loud. It is found in the brutal, silent sacrifices we make to shield the people we hold dearest. The camera stays tight on Lorenzo as the weight of time lost crashes down on him. Whispering through hot tears, ease the agonizing reality that he missed every single milestone. Elena alone taught their child to speak. The grief buried for years finally ruptures. She admits she never stopped loving him, but was terrified that returning would paint a syndicate target on their little girl. Unable to endure distance a second longer, Lorenzo pulls her flush against his chest, and she utterly collapses into him. They remain anchored in the quiet room for an entire hour. Finally, he guides her the freezing balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. He was ready to brace bloody destiny. We spend so much energy building fortresses to survive, but the bravest act of all is simply letting yourself be loved. The moonlight washes over the balcony, casting long, dramatic shadows. Gripping her hand so tightly his knuckles turn white, Lorenzo delivers a monumental bombshell. He is leaving the criminal underworld, spiritually bled dry by the violence. He promises a legitimate escape route, though they both know abandoning the mob is an automatic death sentence. He confesses that the very second he held his daughter, the ruthless mafia boss inside him stopped breathing. Elena's eyes widen with panic. She whispers that crime lords do not simply retire to a sunny beach. Yet, for the first time in his brutally violent life, Lorenzo possesses a fierce, burning desire to survive. Authentic love fundamentally rewires a human being. It strips away the heavy iron armor we thought we needed, leaving us exposed, but finally awake to what truly matters. Look closely at his body language. Lorenzo refuses to slip back into the shadows, cupping her face, with hands stained by decades of syndicate violence. He swears he will never let this second chance die. As their lips meet, 5 agonizing years of pure survival mode melt into the cold wind. The camera pans down to reveal their daughter Sophia and her tiny rescue puppy, Bandit, peeking from behind a potted fern, a desperately needed breath of warmth. But peace is nothing more than a fragile illusion in a mafia thriller. The moment the sun rises, absolute chaos fractures the estate. Bandit begins barking frantically, a roar, a desperate alarm that rips a half-dressed Lorenzo from his sleep. To erase peace, lethalist danger strikes. Lorenzo sprints outside to find the tiny puppy planted at the iron gates. The little dog looks like a miniature gargoyle, growling viciously at a completely empty driveway. Inside, Elena seamlessly grabs Sophia, pulling her from any line of sight. Lorenzo storms into the underground security hub, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his frantic eyes. He orders Marco, the tech expert, to freeze the overnight tapes. Right there at 3:37 in the morning, a massive hooded figure stalks the perimeter walls. The phantom stops, staring dead into the camera lens before melting back into the tree line. Lorenzo feels his blood turn to ice. This was a calculated reconnaissance mission. True danger rarely announces its arrival by violently kicking your front door. It quietly studies your vulnerabilities and patiently waits in the dark. The tension in the room suffocates them as Marco scrubs through the archived footage. The results are terrifying. There are 2 previous sightings from different nights. This unseen predator is methodically mapping the grand estate, timing every guard shift and charting every single blind spot. It is glaringly obvious this is a lethal freelancer sent by a rival family. Shifting into full tactical panic, Lorenzo immediately doubles the perimeter patrols and stations 2 heavily armed shooters upstairs to guard his wife and child. By the time he returns to the sunlit courtyard, the little dog has finally ceased its barking, but the crushing weight of paranoia is permanently locked into Lorenzo's chest. Building massive walls will only protect you from the enemies you can actually see approaching, never the silent ghosts already breathing in your shadows. Out in the yard, little bandit remains locked onto the massive driveway, his tiny ears pinned completely flat. The director frames this beautifully, a small animal staring down a threat that $1 million cameras totally missed. Lorenzo crouches in the grass, gently running a hand over the trembling dog. The puppy thumps his tail against the dirt, but refuses to break his rigid stance. As the afternoon drags on, the family engages in a macabre theatrical performance, pretending they are not waiting for a hit squad. Sophia pulls her father into the library, while on the terrace, Elena awkwardly shares tea with Lorenzo's toxic mother. The matriarch's hands shake violently against her china cup, heavy the regret of fracturing their lives. Deep guilt is an agonizing weight, and true forgiveness is a raging river that can take an entire lifetime to safely cross. Stick with me here, because this is where the substance reaches its boiling point. Lorenzo carries his daughter across the foyer, entirely unaware that the true nightmare has just walked through his door. Dante plays the role of the love brother perfectly, his relaxed smile a masterclass in deception. But little bandit knows exactly what he is looking at. The puppy freezes, and a terrifying warning rumbles from his tiny chest. Dante tries to brush it off with a hollow laugh. As he single step, the dog plants front of his paw, girl baring his teeth. Lorenzo's absorb every micro-expression of their standoff. He says nothing, merely tightening his grip on his child and turning away. Always trust the raw instincts of innocence. They instinctively recognize the dangerous wolves we so willingly invite into our own homes. As midnight approaches, the house goes entirely dark, and the silence feels heavier than cast iron. The puppy completely rejects the comfort of his plush bed. Instead, he flattens his trembling body directly across the threshold of the bedroom door, his sharp ears twitching at every settling floorboard. Elena watches from the shadows with absolute dread, whispering to her husband that asking what the animal is sensing out there in the dark. Lorenzo stands in the dim light, looking exactly like a tragic king crushed beneath the weight of his own crown. He murmurs hollow promises of more cameras and extra mercenaries, but then he kneels on the hardwood, softly admitting that this little stray is a better shield than any hired gun. We often confuse a price tag with actual value. You can easily buy a man's presence with a heavy paycheck, but you can only earn true devotion through genuine love. The puppy wags his tail just once, his eyes fixed on the creeping shadows. By later afternoon, the fragile illusion of this family's safety shatters. Marco has stared at glowing screens for 2 solid days, hunting for a crack in their armor. Finally, he finds it. Buried in the phone record sits a single outgoing call from the East Wing study, connecting to a phantom number. The trace leads straight to a nameless shell corporation. You and I are going to unpack this tragedy together, but ask yourself how they missed the quiet signs. It brings us to a bitter reality. The deepest cuts never come from the loud rivals we keep at a safe distance. The knife in your back is almost always held by the quiet friend invited to sit at your very own dinner table. The paper trail from the shell company leads straight to their oldest rival, Salvatore Vanzetti. And the phone used to make the deal? It belongs to Dante, the man who stood by the family for decades. Marco feels the blood drain from his face. He grabs the radio, his voice shaking as he contacts Lorenzo on his drive back from the city. He begs his boss to return, finally forcing the horrific words out loud. It is Dante. The connection drops dead. Lorenzo buries the accelerator, sending his heavy truck flying down the asphalt, his knuckles turning pale against the wheel. He is a man watching his reality collapse. It reminds us of a dark truth. The most fatal wounds rarely come from the enemies charging our gates. They are struck by the chosen brothers we trusted to guard our backs. Lorenzo practically crushes his phone, dialing the house and the front gate. He gets nothing but an endless, hollow ringing. When his tires tear onto the driveway where worst fears take physical shape, the heavy iron gates swing aimlessly in the cold breeze. He throws himself from the driver's seat before the engine even cuts out. The beautiful foyer is now a silent graveyard of shattered porcelain and overturned furniture. Lying alone on the cold marble floor is a single pink slipper. Two guards are slumped against the wall, heavily sedated. Lorenzo screams his wife's name with a desperate voice that tears his own throat apart. It shows her how truly fragile our existence is. In the space of a single breath, the people we love most can simply vanish into the quiet shadows. He races through the sprawling halls, his boots echoing against the hardwood. The library is empty. The dining room doors swing gently on their hinges. In the kitchen, a single cup of tea sits perfectly still, completely cold. His family has been erased. He stumbles back into the entryway, his lungs burning, when a miserable sound breaks the quiet. He falls to his knees. There, tucked against the wall, is the puppy. The tiny animal is bleeding heavily, his back leg broken at a terrible angle. The intruders simply kicked the brave dog aside like garbage. It forces us to confront a dark reflection of humanity. You can measure the exact depth of a person's character by watching how they handle helpless suspects. The truest form of cowardice is inflicting pain upon those who cannot defend themselves. Despite his ruined body, the small dog performed an act of immense bravery. He dragged himself across the marble floor, pulling his broken weight inch by agonizing inch, just to reach the spot where Lorenzo would find him. Locked tight between his teeth is a torn strip of black wool, the fabric from Dante's custom coat. Lorenzo stares at the cloth and unleashes a sound that barely belongs to a man. It is the roar of a wounded beast. He grips a heavy oak table and flips it over, driving his bare fist through a glass mirror. Shards rain down over his shoulders. It is a chaotic display of pure destruction, but it reveals a universal truth about pain. Anger is so often just a rigid mask for devastating sorrow. Grief is merely a profound love with nowhere else to go. Blood drips from his torn knuckles, but he feels nothing. A vibration in his pocket shatters the silence. The screen flashes with Dante's name. Lorenzo answers, holding the phone in complete silence. The voice on the other end is hollow, instructing him to arrive at Pier 14 by midnight, alone, if he wants to see his family breathe again. Lorenzo ends the call without granting the traitor a single syllable. His quiet calm is terrifying. He sinks onto the ruined floor, pulling the shivering dog against his chest, and presses his jacket against the wound. He whispers that the animal fought with pure honor. It is a vivid example of where true courage resides. Real bravery requires no armor or weapons. Sometimes, the strongest hearts beat quietly inside the smallest chests. The dog shivers violently from shock, yet still finds the strength to weakly lick the face of the crime boss. The doctor arrives, rushing the broken animal down the hall. Meanwhile, Lorenzo descends into the windowless basement. He flattens a map of the city waterfront across a table under a harsh bulb. Summons exactly 12 men. These are soldiers who never spent a single quiet moment with Dante. There is no room left for doubt. Stick with me here, because you and I need to observe what happens when a man is backed into a corner. He strips away the excess until only the iron remains. True loyalty is an incredibly rare commodity. It is never grown during times of easy peace. Unbreakable trust is only ever forged inside the crushing heat of a shared and painful struggle. The air in the basement sits thick, buzzing with the grim promise of violence. Lorenzo addresses his men quietly. The rules of the syndicate no longer apply. Dante may have watered his seed of vengeance over 20 years, but Lorenzo intends to bury him before sunrise. He taps his finger against Warehouse 14 on the map. He will walk through those doors exactly as instructed, a solitary target. But he orders Marco to position 12 hidden rifles in the shadows of the surrounding rooftops before midnight. It is a massive tactical gamble, and it reveals a profound truth about the weight of leadership. There are crucial moments when you cannot hide behind an army. Sometimes you must walk straight into the terrifying darkness, entirely alone, just to protect the light of those you love. The men divide into focused units, pulling dark gear over their shoulders to blend into the rain. Lorenzo demands rating was useless. The operation relies on one visual cue. The moment his coat drops from his shoulders, the firing begins. He locks eyes with every soldier, his voice like freezing water. If anyone shoots early, his family bleeds. Lorenzo climbs the stairs. The puppy lies hesitantly bandaged and sedated, yet the instant the door creaks open, the loyal animal tries to force himself upright, ready to fight. Lorenzo gently presses him back against the blanket. It is a quiet moment that carries a heavy truth about attachment. Genuine love is not always about clinging to one another. Real love often means forcing the ones you cherish to stay safely behind while you face the storm. The small dog releases a trembling whine, his broken body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Lorenz rests his forehead against the animal, whispering a quiet promise to settle the score. As he steps out into the hallway, a mournful howl echoes behind him. Miles away, the reality is incredibly grim. Inside a rusting warehouse, Elena is bound to a concrete pillar. The older daughter remains fiercely upright, masking her terror, while little Vi's Sophia hides her face in her mother's side. We see this violent cycle repeat time and time again. I want you to remember this as we watch the coming chaos unfold together. It is a brutal reality of human conflict. The most innocent souls are always the ones forced to pay the heaviest price for the dark, unspoken sins of the older generation. Step into the room together and watch this dynamic unfold. Salvatore struts in with the unbearable smugness of a man who believes he has already won the game. He tries to weaponize Isabella's age against her, but she remains completely unbroken. With a voice like freezing iron, she reminds him she has buried far worse men than him. His arrogance instantly vanishes. By the rusted door, Dante stands perfectly still, a hollow statue swallowed by the shadows, waiting for Lorenzo. Meanwhile, Elena presses her bruised cheek against little Sophia's hair, whispering a quiet promise that her father is coming. No matter how deeply the darkness tries to bury you, you must never surrender your hope. Sometimes that quiet belief is the only light we have left. In the terrifying gloom, little Sophia displays an absolute mastery of her own fear. She offers a fierce nod, her bright blue eyes glowing with certainty. Cut to midnight. The heavy rain pours down like a cinematic curtain as Lorenzo pulls his black sedan up to the towering warehouse gates. For a fleeting moment, the bitter cold tries to pull him back to the darkest days of his youth, when he was 26 and broken, but he entirely rejects that ghost. Tonight is about reclaiming his family's future. Notice this crucial detail. He walks through those massive steel doors without a single weapon, stepping into a den of wolves with empty hands, armed only with the desperate need to protect your family, is the purest form of human courage you will ever witness. Let us set the scene together. Under the harsh glare of industrial lights, Salvatore holds the center, walled by 30 armed enforcers. Dante lingers over his shoulder, a living monument to betrayal. By the raw concrete wall, the hostages are bruised but breathing. Lorenzo meets his little daughter's terrified eyes for one devastating second. You can almost hear his heart cracking, but he swallows the panic, projecting a terrifying stillness. Dante barks across the floor, mocking his former brother for coming alone. Lorenzo keeps a steady pace, stating he kept his word. Dante raises his heavy gun. We can never truly outrun our past. You have to face your darkest history. You had hoped to finally breathe the clear of a better tomorrow. Dante unleashes a vicious torrent of insults. He snarls that 5 years ago, Lorenzo would have slaughtered this room without a single thought. Love, Dante spits, has made him weak. Lorenzo stands completely still, the pale light catching the absolute resolve in his eyes. He replies that Dante spent 20 years feeding a poisoned grudge, while he wasted 5 years crying over a life he should have defended. They were both fools, Lorenzo says, but his foolish days are done. A twitch of guilt crosses Dante's sweating face before he locks his jaw and levels his pistol. Lorenzo simply grabs the collar of his thick coat, letting the heavy wool drop to the wet concrete. When talking fails to fix a broken reality, taking bold action is the absolute only way to save what truly matters. Watch closely with me now, because the whole room flips in a single heartbeat. A lethal red laser paints the chest of Salvatore's biggest enforcer, dropping him instantly. A flash from the high rafters ends the hidden sniper. Then Marco and his tactical team violently breach the side doors. 12 men flood the floor with terrifying precision, their rifles tearing the silence to shreds. The warehouse plunges into sheer madness. Thick concrete dust chokes the air as bullets bounce off steel crates. But look at Salvatore. Instead of standing tall like a true boss, he shows his absolute cowardice by turning his gun directly toward the bound women. We always find out exactly who a person really is when their back is finally pushed against a cold, unforgiving wall. Piercing the deafening roar of gunfire, Sophia releases a terrified scream. Elena reacts on pure instinct, throwing her body over her daughter. But notice the older woman. For the past hour, Isabella has been quietly shredding her bindings against a jagged metal edge. Now those blood-soaked ropes finally snap. The matriarch rearms her raw hands free and launches herself across the concrete with impossible speed. She forms a human shield over Elena and Sophia just as Salvatore pulls his trigger. 2 deafening cracks shatter the space. Isabella takes 2 heavy rounds straight to her chest, but she only tightens her fierce embrace as she violently collapses. A true mother will always gladly pay the absolute highest price to ensure her family remains entirely safe from the world's darkness. A guttural, agonizing roar ripped from Lorenzo's throat. It is the raw sound of a man watching his universe collapse. He snaps his pistol up and fires 3 flawless rounds. The rival boss is a lifeless corpse, before he even hits the wet concrete. Instantly, the chaotic warehouse is swallowed by a suffocating silence. Dante realizes his tacit mistake and tries to vanish into the smoke, but Marco blocks his path with a raised rifle. Lorenzo sprints across the room, sliding painfully to his knees. His hands tremble violently as he gathers his bleeding mother from the freezing floor. Watching this legendary man completely shred into pieces is devastating. We rarely grasp the precious weight of the people we love until we are the ones holding them as they quietly fade into the dark. Lorenzo begs his mother to stay, his commanding voice cracking under the crushing reality. Isabella opens her eyes, offering a strangely peaceful smile. It is the exact, gentle look she gave him when he was a boy. Reaching out with a trembling hand, she touches Elena. Isabella softly confesses her past judgment was entirely wrong. She calls Elena the greatest blessing to ever heal their bleeding family, begging for a pardon. Elena simply weeps, insisting there is nothing to forgive. Choking on unfamiliar tears, Lorenzo tells his mother how deeply he loves her. Her dying request is beautifully simple. She demands he abandon this poisonous underworld to nurture a real family. Holding on to toxic anger only rots the human soul. Offering true forgiveness is the only path to lasting peace. Isabella instructs them to stop letting her past failures poison their future. She shifts her fading gaze down to little Sophia, who stands frozen in terror. Gathering her last fraction of strength, the dying woman rests a trembling hand against the child's cheek. She whispers for her granddaughter to be brave, remain kind, and embody the light as she herself was too frightened to hold. With those quiet words, the matriarch slips away.
The boss who has not shed a tear in 30 years collapses over his mother's chest.
He openly weeps in front of his surviving soldiers, abandoning his iron facade. Surrendering to that crushing grief is never a sign of weakness. It is the beautiful proof that you truly loved Umsum with all your heart. Let us look at this next moment together because it exposes the dark corners of human nature. Marco emerges from the thick smoke, shoving his rifle into Dante's last spine. The traitor is bound, dark blood dripping from his skull. Marco forces him to his knees mere inches from Isabella's body. Lorenzo rises from the concrete so slowly that the room's air feels dangerously thin. He towers like a storm over the man who used to be his brother. Yet Dante shows zero remorse. His bruised face contorts with spite. He screams that his own father bled out on a cold floor exactly like this, dying just to protect Lorenzo's empire. Dante is consumed by his blind need for payback. It is a profound tragedy how the violent seeds our parents planted in the past can easily bloom in our own toxic obsessions. Tears spill down Dante's face as he screams about receiving only pity while Lorenzo inherited an empire. Lorenzo stares him down, his tone terrifyingly flat. He explains that Dan's father sacrificed his life out of genuine honor, but Dan twisted that noble gift into pure venom. That toxic baggage belongs to Dante alone. Squeezing his eyes shut, Dante braces himself, expecting a fatal bullet, but the execution never comes. Instead, Lorenzo simply turns his back. He calmly ordered Marco, phone Detective Reyes, and handed over the entire surviving syndicate on a silver platter. He walks away, leaving his old fiend to come to rot in a cold cell. Breaking a cycle of violence demands immense strength. Walking away from sweet revenge is the ultimate mark of a truly liberated man. Lorenzo stared down at Dante, his voice dropping to a terrifying growl. "You wanted my life," he whispers. "Now sit in a cell and feel what true emptiness is." Dante tries to speak, but a fragile voice slices through the tension. "Daddy," Lorenzo freezes. Sophia sits near Tuel's bell straws, shaking in the cold rain. Tears pour down her cheeks as she reaches out for her father. She had never called him that before. In that single, beautiful second, every ounce of Lorenzo's need for payback evaporates. He rushes across the floor, crashes to his knees, and pulls his weeping daughter and Elena into a fierce, protective embrace. We often convince ourselves that getting revenge makes us tough. Yet true strength is dropping your anger entirely to shelter the people who actually need you. Walking away from a violent history is rarely simple. That night, a brutal Chicago storm washed over them like a rough baptism, violently stripping away the old lies. Let us jump ahead 6 months. Spring has finally chased all the cold out of Lake Forest. The towering iron gates of the Moretate, say locked tight for 2 bloody generations, are now swinging wide open. Lorenzo is done being a crime boss who answers insults with a weapon. Instead, he does something absolutely unheard of. He stands before the men who once feared him, offering them a clean exit. If they want to leave the violent streets, he will fund their fresh start. It's a powerful reminder for all of us. Anyone can rewrite their dark legacy, as long as they have the raw courage to find Steph Deckert into the light. Lorenzo tore his criminal syndicate down to the studs. His enforcers were told to pack up and drop the Moretti name forever. Surprisingly, many went legitimate. The underground gun vaults were cleared out, turning into boring archives. His fake shipping fronts evolved into actual legal companies. He buried the dirty money deep under clean corporate structures. He willingly lost millions and his street reputation to buy this peace, but he never once blinked. True power is never about ruling with fear. It is knowing exactly when to lay your weapons down to protect your family. Today, the massive estate is transformed. Little Sophia sprints across the green grass in a bright yellow dress, laughing loudly as a huge German shepherd playfully chases her into the warm sun. That loyal dog, Bandit, is a new animal now. The terrible limp from his violent past has vanished. He slides to a halt on the grass, letting little Sophia catch her breath while he guards his tiny human. But stick with me here, because the true emotional weight of this scene lies in the rose garden. Elena kneels in the damp soil. Before Isabella died, she was obsessed with breeding a rare yellow rose. Elena found her handwritten notes in a drawer. Instead of clinging to bitter resentment, she took over the project. We can all take a vital lesson from this. True healing means choosing to water the good things that deeply flawed people leave behind. With gentle hands, she plants those yellow cuttings right at the base of Isabella's white marble headstone. The elegant stone marking the grave carries a heavy truth. The engraving reveals she was a mother who finally learned the meaning of love in her fading days. Nearby, Lorenzo walks through the peaceful garden, handing a warm coffee to Elena. They stand shoulder to shoulder, watching their little girl run through the grass. Lorenzo grows quiet. He mutters that he still cannot figure out why he stopped his car on that freezing night to save a dying dog. Every dark mafia instinct told him to keep driving, to stay hidden in the shadows. It made zero tactical sense. Yet he opened his door anyway. Sometimes the greatest turning points in our lives emerge from simple choices we can never logically explain. Elena gives him a soft, knowing smile, her eyes locked on the bright yellow roses. The light fades to a soft gold. Elena speaks a deep truth, her voice cutting through the wind. She says as our souls always recognize what we need, long before our stubborn brains catch up. His guarded heart knew it while his paranoid mind fought it. We must remember this trust, that quiet pull in your gut, because cold logic often blinds us. The quiet breaks as tiny footsteps hammer the grass. Sophia slides to a stop with Bandit panting beside her, begging for another puppy so her dog has a friend. A massive, rumbling laugh dares from Lorenzo's chest. It is the unguarded sound of a ruthless crime boss finally dropping his iron armor to be a father. They rose on stone steps by Lake Michigan, watching the sun sink, a broken family beautifully healed, and a bandit stretches across their boots, his dark eyes half closed in absolute peace. He is exactly where he belongs. It is beautiful how the greatest saviors arrive in unexpected shapes. That shivering puppy then did far more than help a mother and child survive a freezing ravine. He dragged a criminal family back from the edge of losing their humanity, proving that real love always claws its way through the dark. Life will test every single one of us. We will all make brutal mistakes. We let our stubborn pride scream too loudly, leaving us sit in the headless silence that follows. But please hold tightly to this truth. Even when your world feels burned down, it is never too late to swallow your ego, step out of the shadows, and finally choose the people you love. It is never too late to slam on the brakes when a quiet voice inside begs you to change course. You can always turn around and go back to the people waiting for you. If the weight of this story hit you right in the chest today, you and I should keep this conversation going. Please hit subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone. That beautiful things still happen in this dark world. And we bring you these stories every day because of your incredible support. Honestly, I genuinely want to hear from you. Have you ever felt that heavy gut feeling telling you to stop? Have you ever met a stray animal or a stranger who completely altered your fate? What shifted when you finally decided? Listen, drop your story in the comments below. The internet can be a terribly lonely place. You never know who is scrolling alone in the dark, searching for a sign of hope. One honest sentence you write could be the exact lifeline another exhausted soul needs today. So please do not hold back. From my quiet room to wherever you are listening, I wish you resilient health, peaceful, and a heart full of fierce love that actually sticks around. Look out for the precious people standing in your corner, and never take a single ordinary Tuesday for granted, because our time runs out far too fast. The ultimate lesson from this story is beautifully simple. When this video finally fades to black, put your screen down, go find your people, look them right in the eyes, and hold them just a little bit tighter tonight.